it's also in the basement of the Museum of Natural History in Paris. For decades, researchers, I mean, under colonial times, but also much later, French researchers have been doing research in the park, non-commercial research for the biggest part. And they've been collecting samples, and then they've been building databases. And this data is obviously still at the museum. And so the information and the incredible richness about the park is stored at the Museum of Natural History in Paris. It's been preserved there. And the museum is actually, from its mission, very interested in partnering with the government of Ivory Coast to repatriate that knowledge about the resources, to bring it back into the country, and to collaborate with the country to support them in storing this kind of information and using this kind of information. And so that is where the museum comes in. So a few things would need to happen for all of this to work. First of all is this national framework. The ratification of the Nagoya Protocol needs to be done. The Ivory Coast needs to develop a legislation around ABS and a strategy of how it wants to implement the protocol. The cooperation with the museum needs to be put in place to repatriate the inventories both of genetic resources and also of traditional knowledge. There's quite a bit of anthropological research that's been done, and so documentation of traditional knowledge also of the communities. Once this is done, these inventories would have to be completed and updated. The government really would like to also do an inventory of the traditional knowledge that's present in and around the park, for two reasons. For one reason, just being to be able to preserve this knowledge that often is being lost, but also to see what is there to avoid, for example, patentation of knowledge because nobody knew that this knowledge was out there, etc., etc. But this is, for now, it's an idea of the government, and it's been discussed with some representatives of local communities, but there needs to be a much broader process, obviously, to make sure that communities would want to engage in this kind of process of documentation, that they would be comfortable for it. And then once all this knowledge is there and you've got the databases and you know what's in your park and you know what the potentials are, then you could try and approach commercial actors in view of really going into ABS agreements. So the objectives of this project are in several levels. One is to obtain a better knowledge of the resources and the knowledge that's in the park, around the park. The other is valorization, commercial valorization in terms of ABS agreements, but also the whole non-commercial part of, for example, in terms of traditional knowledge, preserving this traditional knowledge, giving it more visibility, starting processes with local communities, indigenous peoples, and around the park in terms of the value of their knowledge. Another objective is knowledge transfer, capacity development, also through the engagement of the museum. And ultimately, if benefits are realized, the contribution to sustainable financing of the park and hopefully to local livelihoods in terms of engaging the communities. And the broader picture at the national level is really to say we want a framework, an ABS framework that does the direct link to conservation, that makes the direct link to this and other parks, and to integrate ABS in protected areas from the get-go at the national level. So what's happened so far? Ivory Coast has a draft legislation which talks specifically about ABS in the context of their protected areas. This was developed a couple of years ago and unfortunately was never passed, and then the crisis came in Ivory Coast and a lot of things came to a halt, obviously, in terms of the political crisis and the internal violence that happened. And so things are slowly starting to move again now, and they need obviously to retake this. There was also a multi-stakeholder workshop that was held in and around the park with all the stakeholders back then to discuss this idea. But again, there's been a gap between then and now, so that whole conversation has to be taken up again. We had a workshop 2 weeks ago in Abidjan with some of the stakeholders, but there should be obviously another one with more people around the park. So the next steps would be now at the national level, as I said, to update this draft law that exists, because now that we have the Nagoya Protocol, the law would have to be adapted to reflect the international commitments under the Nagoya Protocol. You'd have to do things like developing your ABS strategy, establishing a competent national authority that was mentioned in the movie, etc. In terms of the Thai Park, to enable the linkage there at the local level, you would have to insert ABS and the mechanisms of ABS into the business and management plan of the park, develop or update regulations that regulate access, research, etc. in the park, and very importantly also involve and consult the local communities in and around the park in terms of their role in ABS, their role in terms of traditional knowledge, but also genetic resources. And that's where we also hope to work with natural justice in terms of supporting this process. It's not going to be terribly easy in the case of the Thai Park to work with the communities because of what I mentioned before, this very, very multicultural environment that's around the park. So we're not just talking indigenous peoples who have lived in the area forever and who hold the knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge that is shared among different communities. There's communities that have been there forever. There's communities who came very recently. There's very different ties to the area and to the resources, very different situations of these different communities. So that doesn't necessarily make it easier to put in place these kind of processes, but nevertheless needs to be done. So in terms of the inventories, next step is obviously to have an official agreement between this, the museum in Paris and the OIPR, the agency in Ivory Coast, on the repatriation of this information. The inventories need to be updated, as I said, for two reasons. There might be things that have been missed back then. There might be new species that have appeared in the park since because of changes. There might be species that are not there anymore because some of this data is old and some of these species might have disappeared in the meantime. And in terms of really then going into ABS, there needs to be an evaluation based on this knowledge of the potential for commercial research. One avenue of doing that would obviously be to analyze the traditional knowledge, talk to the communities, see if they're interested in participating in this kind of thing, and use that also to evaluate what the potential is. Develop model ABS agreements, and then ultimately look for private partners, be it in the cosmetics, pharmaceutical, food industry, etc. There's obviously already ties between the museum, also in some private sector companies in France, so it might be possible to find partners there who would be interested in trying this out, in basically trying out what best practice could look like in ABS. I mean, there's certainly a few companies there who would like also, from the orientation of their company and their principles, say, we want to do this right. And there's other companies who might maybe not have a social agenda, but who would still like to understand how it works to avoid being caught in in violation of the Nagoya Protocol once things really get rolling. So this is the idea. Thank you very much. And I am going to pass to Holly directly and would pass the discussion, I think, towards the end so that we can discuss a little bit all these issues together, unless there's really information questions right now, things that haven't been understood that are very pressing. No, okay, then I'll pass on to Holly. Thank you.
Anybody know? Sorry.
I'll tell you.
3:30.
Okay.
On the dot.
Great. Thanks, Barbara. And thanks to GIZ for organizing this, and to IUCN for putting today's program, obviously for being here as well. And thanks to everyone for coming. And hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on some of the, in addition to the very technical aspects that Barbara was just discussing, some of the kind of issues that are maybe a little more specific to Indigenous peoples and local communities in the context of protected areas and this new framework on access and benefit sharing. So I'm going to speak a bit about a lovely little place called Sabah in the right up here. So this is a state of Malaysia. As you can see, Kuala Lumpur is over here. We have Singapore here, Indonesia here and here. This is Sarawak, if anyone's heard of that. And so Sabah is up here. Has anyone been to Sabah? Or is anyone from Malaysia, perhaps? You've been to Sabah? It's okay? Yeah, good. Are you from Malaysia?
No. I've been there.
Okay. Great. I was hoping we'd have some Malaysians here. Okay, great. So Sabah is on the island of Borneo. And as you can see, there's Sabah, Sarawak, which are Malaysia. This is Kalimantan, which is part of Indonesia. And Brunei is its own little country. So the island itself is already complex enough. And when you get to Sabah, this is a map of the protected areas, or the parks of Sabah, not only the protected areas. We have marine parks here. This one, I have to say, is not gazetted yet. It's in the process. It'll be a 1.4 million hectare marine park with 80,000 people. We have Kinabalu Park, which is the focus of my chat today. This is Crocker Range Park, and we have Tawau down here, and so on. So you'll see there's kind of a massive part of Sabah that is not represented in the park system. There are some concession areas that are protected for now, but are likely to be gazetted, or de-gazetted rather, into palm oil plantations, as most of Sabah has been already, unfortunately. So there's a struggle within the protected area system to ensure connectivity between especially these two major ones, as well as with Tawau Park down here, and some key forest reserves in other areas that are currently protected but are likely to become palm oil concessions soon. So it's kind of a bit of a race against time between conservation agendas and very, very acute kind of economic development agendas, and that's in the context of Malaysia trying to become a developed country by 2020. So a lot of the kind of challenges that we have with conservation in Malaysia, especially in Sabah, because it's the poorest state in Malaysia, is in that light of kind of fast-tracking quote-unquote development. So this is a bit of background. So this is the lovely Mount Kinabalu. It's kind of the focus of Sabah's pride and joy. It's over 1 million tourists come to Mount Kinabalu every year. It's, as I'll show you in a moment, surrounded by lots of communities, indigenous Dusun communities. And they have, outside of the actual park, is a really beautiful mosaic of subsistence agricultural lands, shifting cultivation, as well as some small plantations for minor cash cropping and things like that. So there's a huge array of biological and cultural diversity in Kinabalu. Because of the altitude, it goes up to over 4,000 meters. It has some of the richest flora in the world, about 5,000 plant species in 1,600 square kilometers only. It's IUCN Category 2 protected area, so strictly protected. It's also a World Heritage Site, so not supposed to be any people at all in the area. And as with most strictly protected areas, there are people in there, because when it was gazetted by the Brits in the 1960s, there were indigenous peoples living there. They had customary territories that the British administration didn't quite understand. So of course the national park was kind of imposed upon, subsuming some of those territories and not quite recognizing those customary boundaries. So there are some difficulties with boundary issues, of course, and with communities still going into the park to access both some agricultural lands as well as hunting areas. So the Dusun communities have very, very high levels of traditional knowledge and very diverse customary systems of managing the resources in the area as well. The mountain itself is of really, really central spiritual and cultural importance to the Dusun. The summit, actually, traditionally, they weren't ever supposed to go to the summit because it's known as the gateway to the heavens. So it was kind of a resting place for the deceased and kind of a passing place onwards to the next phase of life in their cosmology. So So it's not just a World Heritage Site, it's also a very, very important sacred site. So anyone who works with communities will know there's this, and this is a very simplistic depiction, I'm sorry for that, but there's a kind of bit of a web and cycle between biodiversity, culture and spirituality, customary laws, community-based resource management, traditional knowledge systems, and the whole landscape, the whole territory. So you can't just have traditional knowledge in isolation, you can't just have culture in isolation, you can't just have customary law in isolation. It's all very interconnected, and in order for any one of them to be sustained, you need kind of all of them together. So some of the legal challenges in Sabah, well, everywhere actually, but primarily in Sabah, to biological and cultural diversity in this system. First of all, there's kind of a legal fragmentation of indigenous people's territories and ways of life. By this I mean you have something like protected areas looks at only one part of their territory, or one part of their way of life. You have agricultural laws, you have forest laws, you have water laws, you have wildlife laws, and so on. This is the same in every country, and it kind of just looks at the whole landscape in tiny little bits. You have institutions mandated to implement those laws in tiny little pieces, and they don't really talk to each other. Sorry if there's any government officials here, please convince me otherwise. So that's kind of one of the fundamental issues with the legal framework. It doesn't really respond to the reality of indigenous people's ways of life. Also, with new legal frameworks, new in the past couple hundred years kind of thing, they often conflict with or overlap with customary legal systems. So ranging from customary boundaries to actually customary procedures and ways of engaging with other people. In another context, you also have maybe religious laws. Sharia law also is in some parts of Sabah, so we have 3 legal systems operating at the same time. And also another fundamental challenge is the overarching emphasis on resource extraction and exploitation. And this really, really drives the whole economy in Malaysia right now. So you have things like palm oil expansion, mining, dams, etc. And they're definitely fast-tracked, no matter what indigenous people's rights may be. Okay, Paula, protected area woman over here. What do we see in this diagram? Just speaking to the...
Well, if you ask me, just to answer to your question, there are instruments.
We can't do this
Yeah.
without the mic.
Oh, sorry. No audience.
Yeah, that's fine. No, this.
Sorry.
Just to answer to your questions, there is, well, I come from Colombia for the audience, and we have a special legal framework for indigenous peoples, so they're public authorities. So when it comes to protected areas management and everything that has to do with indigenous peoples, we talk in the same level. So it's not like we are asking them for do things to protect area management sake, but it has to be agreed because they are they have the same level of authority. So I can see this here.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's actually. Thank you. That's actually a really nice example because I'm just saying in Sabah it's an extremely segregatory kind of approach to protected areas. It's very much state governs, state manages. They don't have provisions yet for communities to govern their own conserved areas. So it's this kind of, basically a desegregation of what actually happens in practice. And when we're looking at access and benefit sharing, it's easy to just think, oh, we only have to deal with ABS, okay? There's nice, traditional knowledge happening, it's kind of medicinal plants going on, but actually if you go to communities and start to talk to them about these issues, you realize you have to deal with many other issues as well. So first and foremost, traditional authorities, customary laws, free, prior and informed consent, absolutely fundamental to anything to do with ABS for communities. Also, a huge other aspect of law is plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, or also animal genetic resources for food and agriculture. And when you look at these issues, you start to realize, whoa, there's a whole lot of other legal frameworks out there, And they all relate to these issues. Okay? You can't only look at access and benefit sharing and say that's all we have to deal with. If you want to deal with these kinds of things at the community level, you generally have to deal with land tenure, customary territories, customary use, knowledge, sacred sites, protected areas, water, etc. So this is the whole system that needs to be understood when you're beginning anything to do with access and benefit sharing with communities, I would say. If you only look at access and benefit sharing, then probably you're going to set yourself up for some major headaches later on. So in addition to those other kind of overarching legal challenges, in the context of protected areas in Sabah, I say there are some significant overlaps of customary territories, imposed restrictions on access and use rights. There's kind of this distinction between governance and management by the state versus customary stewardship by communities. In the context of access and benefit sharing, complexities with defining community, defining consent, defining competent authorities vis-a-vis customary laws. So I'm not going through all these, but again, to kind of highlight the complexity of the legal frameworks that you may be dealing with in access and benefit sharing, you have, I put UNGIP first because I think it's most important. You have everything from UNGIP to